GM. Welcome to the GM podcast. I am Griff Green, and this is our first episode. And I really am excited to share this concept and really start kind of foundational with what are we doing in the crypto space and give some context. And so I invited Brett Scott to be our first actual interview. And Brett Scott has an incredible wealth of knowledge on monetary systems and monetary theory, and does a really good job. I'm not saying that there's one type of money or another type of money, but really just kind of being definitive on what money is and what money isn't. I kind of put his feet to the fire on getting what is crypto then? What is crypto if crypto is not money? But in the end, it was really difficult to get him to answer it, and we will have to do another podcast on it. So I hope you enjoy our first GM. This is a project sponsored by Giveth, which I'm branding very well here. You'll see in the podcast. And so thank you to Giveth for sponsoring this and making all this possible. And thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy it. This is actually the first episode of GM. Today, we're going to talk about what is money. Figured this is a good way to create a foundation. The real goal of this podcast is to understand what are we dealing with in the crypto sphere and how can we use crypto to make the world a better place and actually improve the world that we live in today. And I'm honored to have Brett Scott as our first guest. Brett, hey, Brett, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, actually, I don't know. I always find it hard to introduce myself, but I'll give it a go. I'm Brett Scott. Most recently, my kind of new incarnation is like the author of Cloud Money, Cash Cards, Crypto, and the War for Our Wallets, which is my latest book. I did another book back in 2013 called The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance. I actually have a background in a variety of things, but economic anthropology. I also worked in the financial sector in over-the-counter derivatives contracts during the financial crisis. So I have some sort of high finance background, but also kind of blend that with anthropology and kind of like political activism. So over the years, I've worked on a bunch of different stuff, like projects around financial reform, alternative finance, alternative currencies, all sorts of things. But more recently, I do a lot of stuff around advocating for the protection of the physical cash system. I also get involved in the crypto world and have been involved in the crypto world over the years, albeit I'm often seen as like a slightly skeptical voice. Maybe I like to see myself as a more balanced voice.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say so. And but maybe before we get into crypto criticism, which I'm really excited about, honestly, and there's pretty much why I have you on. Let's talk about just like a foundational level. What is money? In the textbooks, they always say, hey, it's a store of value, a medium of exchange, and a unit of account. But like, what do those even mean? And it doesn't really say what money is. It says what money does. Like, what do you think money is?
Yeah, it's quite a tricky one to distill into a soundbite. Sometimes I get asked this on, national TV or something like that, and you got to suddenly like stick this into like a 10-second, which is very, very hard to do. But I mean, if I was doing that at its most generic level, I would probably tend to say something like, money is a system of economic access tokens.
Okay.
That hold together an interdependent network of people. Like something like that. That's where I tend to go with monetary descriptions to see. And I think one of the things when I'm describing money, one of the most important concepts that I have in the background is this idea that we're in an interdependent network or an interdependent structure, right? So if I was giving the most sort of generic, like functional description of money, like what it does, I would say something like holds together a network of people who can't survive without each other. Right. Now, the functions of money approach, which you often hear the economists doing, is a terrible approach, in my humble opinion.
Yeah.
As you say, it claims to describe money by what it does, but it doesn't even really do that. It kind of like gives these very sort of like weird, like metaphorical descriptions of what it does. But yeah, you can kind of contrast a functional description of something to a structural description. So, normally when you're describing something, pretty much anything in the world, if you ask somebody to describe it, you'll have two approaches. You can describe something by its function. So you say, so for example, if I ask you what your phone is, or let's say you have an iPhone, I say, what is that? You could say, oh, it's a thing I use to call people. It's a thing I use to do something, right? So that's a kind of functional description. But if you have to ask an engineer, like, what is that? They would probably give you an actual structural account of literally what it is, all right? Mm-hmm. And the structural description of what it is would tend to give an explanation for how it achieves its functions, all right? So you'd say, this is a device made of various materials that like connects to something, whatever the structural description is. And as a result of this, I can speak to somebody on the other side of the world. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now with money, there's a very strange problem, which is people jump straight to these functional descriptions and they just totally neglect to describe any kind of structure. And actually what economists tend to do is they tend to say, they tend to actually completely leave out the structure and they just say money is anything that achieves these functions here. Mm-hmm. All right. Which I find an incredibly vague and like evasive way of trying to describe money, right? They basically refuse to describe the structure of money. And there's a bunch of interesting possible reasons why economists refuse historically to describe money. And actually there's people who actually study the politics of this and when that started to become a thing. So people like Christine Desan, for example, is a person who's one of the writers on this kind of stuff around how a lot of economics discourse kind of like almost what's the words? Whitewashed or kind of sort of depoliticized money, right? So like refuse to actually speak about what it is, but sort of says these like vague things, like sort of surface level things about how people experience it rather than what's actually going on in the background. So a lot of the stuff when I'm looking at monetary systems is to try and look at what is the structure and then to say like, how does it relate to these imagined functions? So when I say, I will tend to describe money in its current form as a vast system of maybe a triple-tiered system of IOUs that are linked together, pushed out by large institutions that come to form a system of economic network access tokens for a horizontal network of people who are interdependent.
Okay,
something
so
like that.
let's break some of that down. So economic access tokens. What do you mean by that?
Something that enables you to access a network of people who you're dependent upon. If you think about your everyday life, right, when you walk out onto the street, you basically, in a modern society, you cannot survive by yourself, all right? I mean, maybe you could try, but very, very, very few people can actually do it. Back in time, people could actually do it. There's ways of surviving on your own. It's called like subsistence economies. You're actually able to make all your own stuff and so on. But for the vast majority of people, there's no way they can possibly survive nowadays without accessing other people. All right. So the core sort of experience, let's call it like the sort of modern condition, right, when you walk out into the city streets, is that you'll see all these strangers, these people who you have no idea who they are, but you know that on average, you're going to have to call on them. You don't necessarily know which of them you will call upon, all right, but you're going to have to connect to them somehow, right? And that's going to be the same experience for every single other person in that same society. Everyone has this requirement to connect to everybody else, but there's no sort of like guarantee that you of who you're going to connect to. So one of the sort of core things in any modern market system is that you as an individual depend upon everybody else as a collective, but the collective doesn't necessarily depend upon you. Mm-hmm. All right. So the core experience of being unemployed, for example, is when you have to get access to everybody else, but they're not interested in getting anything from you. Mm-hmm. Right. That's like the existential terror in a market society when you realize you're in an interdependent network system, but you have no means to access it, right?
Yeah, good luck buying groceries without the local currency or
in a sense, this is where if you start to sort of think in these kind of terms, this is where a lot of the sort of dynamics of money comes out. And one of the main problems in traditional economic theory and not only traditional economic theory, also in sort of like libertarian ways of understanding money, and a lot of very typical ways of understanding money start from a different, I'm going to use a bit of a kind of a wanky academic term here, but they start off from a different background, imaginary. All right. So like an imaginary is a kind of like almost like a subconscious canvas, right, upon which you project your world, right? So like a lot of people in the back of their heads have this idea that what an economy is a collection of individual people who are trying to trade with each other. All right. And you got to try and convince the other people to trade. And you're an individual fighting against all these other individuals, right? And that's a very, very, very typical background imaginary that leads people often to believe that what money is a kind of this like object that you try to use to convince other people to do deals with you. All right. So a lot of traditional economics conceptions of money imagine it almost like a kind of substance or value that you dangle in front of other people to convince them to do something with you. All right.
And you would say it's more like a coordination, like lubricant, or? Well,
I'd say it's just a false starting point to understand any human economy, right? Because human beings are not independent de facto.
Yes.
Right. There's never been any human being that's been independent, right? So if you're starting from the perspective that you have a bunch of independent, rational beings who are then sort of trying to come together and find out how to trade, that's automatically just the wrong starting point for understanding any monetary system. But that's what economists do. This is how they invented barter theories of money. They would imagine that there's all these people who've somehow survived, right? And they've somehow made things, right? Then they're holding all these things, and now they're like facing each other in some kind of like market battlefield. And they're like, okay, I have to try and convince the other people to trade. And now, I'm going to have to show them this object here. Then maybe I can convince them to give me that. But oh shit, isn't this really inconvenient trying to barter these things? Maybe we should invent some kind of more efficient thing to make it more streamlined, right? So you can see how the entire economics conception of money, which is this sort of like commodity-like object, emerges from a starting point where they imagine human beings are independent of each other. All right.
But then your argument is more for chartalism and like
my argument is that if you start from a different starting point, which is that human beings are not independent from each other, it tends to change the way you think about money, right? Okay. And it doesn't necessarily have a standard way of affecting it, but you will tend to see that given that human beings cannot survive without each other, right? Money does not have to be a kind of commodity, right? Mm-hmm. You're not having to try. You don't have to like convince people to trade. They have to trade. There is no option, right? Yeah. It's not like when I'm in a market, I'm there facing the shopkeeper being like, hey, I'm going to try and convince you through a series of like, rhetorical, strategies that my money is worth taking. It's like the person has to take your money. There's no option for them to not do it. They can maybe hold out for a little bit, but if they don't, they're literally going to be shafted out of the network, right? Yeah. You can't survive unless you do it, right? So this is the way you got to kind of be thinking about the monetary system. And a lot of like credit theories of money is like what I tend to come from. This is the sort of the way that money's thought about. It's thought about as the sort of thing that cannot be separated from this kind of situation of interdependence, all right? I hope I'm kind of going on this sort of long rant. I don't know if this is making sense.
Yeah, no, I think it's making sense. Although I do want to focus on what it is as opposed to what it is not, because it's really easy to take things down. But I hope to be building things up.
Sure. Look, there's it's important to realize that over time, having originally made this critique that there is this fixation on the functions of money rather than the structures of money, and that's linked to this problem of people in economics of them seeing human beings as being independent agents rather than interdependent parts of a meta-organism, right? Yeah. That doesn't mean there's a single structure of money over time, right? There have been different types of money, right, that have worked within these interdependent networks, right? So I'm not saying there's only one type of money historically, or that there's no other way to do this kind of stuff, right? But it's like,
would you say that money has to reach a certain level before it can be called money? Like that people have to use it? It's like the dominant force.
I mean, the way that I would think about it is, I would say it has to be the primary way that an interdependent network is holding itself together. All right. So
like
there are many other sort of money-like things that can operate on the margins in many of these. So, for example, right now we can. I don't want to go straight into crypto, but right now, for example, crypto tokens have certain money-like properties, but they're really not operating as a true monetary system. All right. It doesn't mean that you can't do forms of exchange with them, but it means they're not the actual things that are holding together the network right now. Right.
Yeah.
And actually,
they're an economic system, but not necessarily a monetary system, would you say?
Well, they're actually dependent upon the normal monetary system, right? They're in a sense, they ride on top of the existing monetary system, right? So, and that's historically, you found the situation many, many times. Sometimes the way, for example, I heard Vitalik recently, Vitalik Buterin, talking about the way he phrased it, which is quite a sort of traditional way, is he's saying, oh, sometimes there's a separation between the functions of money. Sometimes you have, the unit of account separated from the means of exchange. All right, this kind of thing. Again, he's stuck in a functions of money paradigm, but this idea that there's these sort of bifurcations of money over time, it's basically talking about the fact that at any one point there'll tend to be one dominant money system holding things together, but on top of that, you can then have these other systems that will operate within that. All right. So, for example, historically, if you look at people like Adam Smith, they will give these examples of people using like cod in Newfoundland as a form of money, right? And Adam Smith was looking at that. He says, I see these people like using this sort of dried fish as money. But actually, if you peel back the layers of what was going on there, people were not actually using the fish as, well, they were sort of, it was a kind of an intermediary form. And what they were really doing was looking at what its monetary price was in the background.
Of course, yeah.
Right? And saying, if I was to resell this for money, right, and give you that would, let me put it differently. If you wanted $100 from me, how much fish would I have to sell to get $100? And let me give you that amount of fish. All right. Yeah. Yeah. What you're doing there is you're actually using, for example, the dollar system, but you're now using it via a sort of intermediary object, right? That's called counter trade, which is something I write about a lot. But then what that will give rise to is a kind of a different means of exchange to the unit of account, right? So you're using this sort of like secondary form that's attached to the primary money. This is kind of a complex way of describing it. Right? Yeah, but in historical systems, there's lots of this going on.
The secondary form isn't money; it's a commodity. It's
it depends. I mean, in my world, it's not money, right? But if somebody's using a sort of very shallow definition of money as the thing I use to exchange, kind of one of these sort of shallow functional descriptions, then to them it will be money, right? Because it's I'm using this to exchange, aren't I?
Therefore, but it's not the dominant system that's bringing everyone together in like a coordination mechanism.
No, exactly. And what you're actually doing is that you're pricing it via the monetary system, and then you're using the monetary system as the sort of determinant of what the exchange ratio is going to be.
So can there be two monies or three monies or three monetary systems working together in an area?
Yeah, I mean, again, you got to be thinking about, I mean, the current global monetary system is, in a way, bear in mind, we live in a global economy, right?
Yeah.
So that your iPhone, for example, depends on, I don't actually know if you have an iPhone, but let's imagine you do. Android, right? Android depends on pools of labor in China and the Democratic Republic of Congo, all around the world. You basically have all these different economic networks, people who work in these sort of interdependent systems, right? And they're often operating under different national monetary systems. But we've formed these ways to connect the monetary systems together. So in a way, you could describe the global economy as being held together by a kind of like meta monetary system. But in reality, it's going to be made up of a bunch of subsystems that are all connected together, right? And there's going to be interplays between those, right? with the US dollar often being the sort of primary kind of like sort of structure within that. But yeah, we have these kind of interrelating networks, right? So I don't want to be like too reductionist about it to say there aren't forms of interacting money, but we tend to have these intuitive ways of working out when something is money or not, right? And one of the classic ways of working it out is, what do you think about when you hold it in your hand? All right.
Yeah.
So one of the core tests to work out if you're holding something that's money or not is if you hold it in your hand, you tend to think about things, right? Goods and services, right? You tend to think about things beyond money when you hold it in your hand. All right. That's a very core feature of a monetary system. It's the thing that enables you to access everything else, right? Now, or which is another way of saying it's the thing that gives you access to everybody else in the interdependent network of people. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. So whereas when you're holding a good, such as this thing here, when I'm holding this, I will either imagine what I can use it for, which is I can drink this delicious lemon tea, right? Or I might imagine a resale price in money, right? How to convert it back into the monetary system, right? So with a typical good, you'll either think about it in terms of itself or in terms of what its resale price is, right? You're not going to really think about it in terms of other goods normally. Okay?
Yeah.
So this is one of the core things that you'll see in monetary systems, is that the units of money are essentially these access tokens to sort of everybody else in the system, right? Which is why they have a sort of open-ended nature to the monetary system.
So then,
steer me here a bit.
So Bitcoin is not money because it's not giving you access. Like, I mean, yes, there's services of like Purse.io where Americans can order anything on Amazon, but it's not really the main. It's not the main use case of Bitcoin, and it doesn't. You know, if you don't have Bitcoin, there's nowhere in the world where you'll be like, oh, well, I guess I can't, I can't relate with anyone. I can't like have access to anyone else's goods and services. So then what is Bitcoin? What are these commodity cryptocurrencies? Like, what are they? Commodities? Are they economic systems? How would you define them?
Bitcoin, well, it's numbers written out after you exert energy. I mean, that's what it is.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So it's there's commodity that's power that's representing energy spent, or
doesn't represent energy spent. No, it's just uses energy. I mean, like bear in mind all goods in the world, including this cup that I just showed you, requires energy to create, right? So it's the energy gets used in the making of the object. It doesn't mean that the object stores anything, but the energy is gone. Right. Well, at least, in the sort of, so yeah, Bitcoin tokens require energy to create. But really, if you look at what Bitcoin tokens are, they're numbers, right? Numbers with branding pasted over them, and sort of a cultural, the sort of technical structure of Bitcoin is that you write out numbers, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a sort of a secondary project on the side, which is how to create a sort of culture around that and sort of imaginations around what those are supposed to be, with sort of like commodity imagery and kind of like language, and sort of you're supposed to imagine them as being coins, but and so on. But like if I was like an alien coming from outer space, and I just looked at literally what these things are, it's like, well, somebody seems to have written out the number 50 here.
Yeah.
Like,
okay.
That's what it is. All right. But there's a system that constrains how many of these numbers you're allowed to write out.
Scarcity.
Right? So it has rules in it that says you're not allowed to write out more than this number of these numbers. Right. So, I mean, Bitcoin really to me is like a system of, okay, let's move away from the number stuff. It's like a system of digital objects, but they're quite sort of generic blank digital objects that have branding pasted over them, and you can move them around. Right.
Does the system of generation come into play with what it is? Like for instance, in the public goods space, I'm really enjoying this idea of economic games. Where you're playing a game, you're earning points. Those points happen to be transferable digital scarcity. but it's creating an economic system or a system of behavior rewards and incentives. Do you feel like that? I mean, it's like there's the use cases of crypto versus what crypto is. Obviously, it's not a monetary system. Would you say it's an economic system? Or
I mean, if I was on TV, right, and I'm like, asked by some presenter, like, what is Bitcoin? I mean, I'm not going to go into a long description of like, how they're produced or the sort of, consensus mechanisms and stuff. And basically, it's like, here's a system of digital collectibles, right? Limited edition digital collectibles that you can move around, right? Mm-hmm. Much like, an antique medallion in a antique store, it has an object that has a certain appearance, albeit in the case of Bitcoin, the appearance is really a sort of secondary structure pasted over what it actually is. I mean, they're just numbers, right? But they have a sort of like a mental imaginary of being like an object. So here you have a system of digital objects that can be passed around, and they've come to have a price in the actual monetary system. All right. Now, once they have a price, a property emerges, which is you can swap them for other things that have prices, right? Mm-hmm. Which is that process I described earlier with Adam Smith and the COD, right? COD is an object within a monetary system. It has a price, right? If, it costs, I don't know, $5 for the COD, and you have something which costs $15, I can give you 3 CODs for the thing that costs $15, right? Mm-hmm. That's a process of counter trade. What I've done is I've said, if I was to give you 3 of these, you'd have to pass me $15 back, and then I'd pass you the $15 to get the thing from you. Yeah. Right? So why don't we just cancel that out and just hand each other the things? Yeah. Right. That's counter trade. It's basically you're canceling out the monetary part of 2 transactions to end up with these 2 goods that will move. So all crypto transactions basically rely upon this, or at least all the say Bitcoin transactions when you're doing quote unquote buying something with Bitcoin.
I would argue with the value of the counter trade, and a lot of the value with barter, is that it's outside of the traditional monetary system, which has like extra like things built on top of it. Like
counter trade can be very useful.
Yeah. So
but bear in mind how it's working though. How in order for Bitcoin to have counter trade ability, it has to first get a price in the actual monetary system. Yeah. To determine the counter trade ratios. All right.
And the price, I would argue the price comes from the utility of like being able to barter effectively, or being able.
I mean, then you have to describe why it crashes 40% at a time and jumps up again, right? Because that utility doesn't shift.
Well, no, it's not, and it's not the price. That's a liquidity issue. I don't think the price and the utility necessarily have to be hand in hand, but the utility of it is that, and from my perspective, is that you don't need to transact. You can transact digitally without using the traditional rails, right?
Sure.
So there's lots of
there's a conceptual problem though, which is that you have to give an original account of why the thing you're handing over is useful, right? Like, because there's a typical move made in Bitcoin circles, which is the fact that you can move the object makes it useful. Mm-hmm. All right. So the person says, yeah, but it's useful as an alternative to the banking sector. And it's like, well, if I'm going to hand an invisible digital object to you, like, do you want it or not? Right?
Yeah. Well, no, you don't want it.
You have to kind of have an account for why the thing that bypasses the banking sector has a kind of use, right? So there's a certain circularity that goes on in the Bitcoin descriptions about why it's useful. People say, oh, yeah. It's like they say, like, oh, we developed these new rails, and you're like, okay, well, what's in the train carriages being like transported on the rails? Well, right? Is it like an empty carriage, right? And then the idea is like, well, the fact that you can move it fills the carriage.
The first big use case really was the Silk Road, right? Like, you could get Bitcoin and you could buy things that you normally can't buy things. That you can't normally buy in your traditional economy. No, you're not reliant on it. No one needs the things that are on the Silk Road to survive. But it's like luxury items, you could say, that they can get in a much easier way than they could using the current forms of money that they have access to. Right.
So bear in mind, when in the early days of Bitcoin, if you went to somebody and you're like, do you want these invisible digital objects for these drugs? The person will be like, no.
No,
Why?
but
Why will I take these objects from you? I don't even know what they are. There seem to be numbers with branding put over them, right?
yeah.
It actually was only once the speculative market in Bitcoin developed, which created this idea. It was a sort of a separate act, right? Which is this a sort of speculation market developed, which wasn't really assessing like the sort of intrinsic usefulness of the objects, right? It was sort of a play on a sort of like this idea that you could resell them. Mm-hmm. That is what induces the counter tradability, which then makes them seem useful. All right. Yeah. Right. So now I can go.
So now there's other forms of currency besides Bitcoin that I would say are way more useful, like Ethereum, where like, okay, well, now I can build very interesting things that people can engage with, which people were doing with Bitcoin, but now, Bitcoin's more like digital gold. But Ethereum is, they argue is digital oil, and you can use it as a commodity to build other applications on top of it, including other economic systems.
Yeah, I mean, Ethereum definitely has more of a kind of native use cases, which you claim boosts the sort of money-like nature of the tokens, right? Mm-hmm. But one of the important things to sort of like maybe to sort of step back a little bit, because we kind of went down this Bitcoin rabbit hole to some extent. One of the reasons why Bitcoin is very compelling to people is partially because the public in general has quite a poor understanding of monetary systems, or quite a surface level understanding of monetary systems. All right. So if you take, it's quite easy to convince somebody that you've created a monetary system by sort of showing them a numbered digital object. All right. Mm-hmm. Now, this sounds kind of trite, but it's true. Like if I pick up my phone, right, and I'm like, and I had some sort of like, program that just has a number on it with like 10, right, and a symbol next to the 10, I could be like, here, I created money, right? And a person's going to look at it, they're like, seems to be a number with a symbol attached to it. My experience with the monetary system is that that's what it is, right? Like these sort of like numbered objects that appear before me, right? It's very, very easy to sort of just like make the assertion that a numbered object is money, right? Mm-hmm. And especially when it has no other apparent use. Okay, so if I took a chocolate, if I fashioned a chocolate in the shape of a coin, all right, and put a 10 on it, I could come up to you and be like, look, here's my money, right? But you would immediately know that actually what it was a chocolate fashioned to look like money, right? Yeah. And you'd be like, oh, interesting, that's funny, isn't it, right? Or, there's the thing, and you'd eat it, okay? If I took an invisible object with no actual body, all right, suddenly it suddenly feels more money-like, right? Because there's no actual utility that distracts you in a sense, right? So there's this idea that the sort of the act of writing out numbers and putting them into this with like symbols is like pretty much all you need to do to convince somebody that something's like roughly like a monetary system. And really Bitcoin is kind of like this. You sort of just write out these numbers and put symbols next to them, and you say you can move them around, therefore it's a monetary system. I mean, the Bitcoin white paper literally says this, not exactly like that, but it's basically like, hey, we've created this peer-to-peer cash system. What is it? Oh, it's a system of writing out numbers that you can move around. All right. Yeah. You can put a symbol next to it. Like this is the description.
That no one can stop you from moving,
right. So the idea is think about what the implicit idea in the Bitcoin white paper is about what money is. It's just like objects that can be moved that we can sort of all just convince each other that they're sort of like a monetary system, right? So actually what's interesting about Bitcoin is that whoever designed it was somebody who was probably very, very good at, all the sort of cryptography stuff, but had very, very little grounding in actual monetary.
Or I mean, they're just following a different house, right? Like the Austrian commodity version of money, right? That's more.
But even the Austrians wouldn't agree with that, right?
Really?
A lot of traditional Austrians would be like, that's not money.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, they think
there's a new school Austrian world, which is all the sort of like new crypto people who but the old school Austrians would reject that.
Really? Oh, wow.
There's a lot of old school Austrians who'd be like, that's not money, right?
Yeah.
But of course, the sort of new wave Austrian school has been given a whole bunch of sort of like power by the kind of crypto world, right?
Yeah.
Because in a way, that's one of the only sort of like paradigms you can use to describe. I mean, it's worth if you want to kind of delve into this, it's worth looking at the historical competition between the two big paradigms of thought on money, right? The commodity paradigm versus the credit paradigm, because it helps to sort of illustrate some of the reasons why some people find it like obvious that Bitcoin's money, and why others would be like, I just reject the idea of it's money, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, wait, before we go too deep into that, like I want to try to bring it more towards these. What is it? You know, what like
yeah.
You know, because like and not just for Bitcoin and not just for Ethereum, but for, you know, smaller tokens, smaller projects that they're creating a token. They're definitely creating some form of digital scarcity that it's being moved around and people are using it for something, you know. Like, how do you define it? What is it? How do we stand on like a solid,
well, I think it's
you know, academic foundation?
Let me say one thing, which is, I know it seems like I'm being evasive, but in a way to answer this question, it's kind of like requires a bunch of sort of like background scaffolding.
Sure.
Right. So one of the things we shouldn't try to do is to establish some platonic ideal of what money is. You know, I don't know if you know these terms, platonic ideal, but like we often have this like trap of imagining that there are these sort of pure essences in the world. Mm-hmm. All right. And then sort of Plato's, you know, theory of forms, he has this kind of this idea that there's a sort of like a parallel dimension where the sort of pure essence of things lives, the pure essence of freedom, the pure essence of like this, the pure essence of money, and everything else in the world is trying to emulate these forms, right? Mm-hmm. And then the form of forms is like God, which is like the thing that all the forms try to emulate, right? So there's this sort of weird abstract zone of these like imaginary perfect forms. And often when people are trying to address this money question, they're almost like trying to imagine some sort of strange platonic ideal of like what the sort of ideal money is. All right, floating, decontextualized from society. And in reality, like a better thing to do is to sort of like look at the historical development of economies and the sort of changing structure of economies over time to see how the different types of money emerge and the different contexts you'll find money in. All right. And sort of economic anthropology is good for this because economic anthropology tends to look a lot at pre-capitalist communities, basically people who are not completely dependent upon market structures for survival, all right? And if you think about your very, very earliest communities, your kind of hunter-gatherer communities, which is what human society was like for like, 100,000 years, you will find certain forms of exchange, but it's really not the dominant like thing happening in the society, all right? You've got very small bands of people who are largely sort of self-sufficient. There'll be forms of internal distribution going on, but there's no need for some like abstract monetary system. Yeah. Then you'll get these sort of larger structures, which often like sort of tribal societies, which have very strong gift economy structures to them. And for a lot of like history, even up into like the 1700s, you'll get like these sort of gift economy structures, which is like there are these sort of formal ways of people distributing goods to each other, right? Upwards and downwards of up hierarchies, sort of chiefs, and then back down again. And there's always sort of like elaborate structures, but you'll find markets on the outside of those societies, right? What the core feature of a capitalist society is that the market is basically the dominant core structure, and everything else has been pushed to the outside, right? So you'll also forms of sort of community gifting and reciprocity are sort of seen as the sort of like the least dominant style of economic interaction, and that really only emerges in the era of modern states. Okay, so there's this big element of states being very, very core in promoting monetary systems as the dominant way of doing interaction, right? Yeah. So if you go back to a lot of the sort of anthropological examples of pre-capitalist money, such as like shell money. Right? Shell money, like which is just these strings of shells, operates nothing like you would imagine money operates, right? Nowadays, when we think about money, we're like, oh, it's this thing I can use to go get Coca-Colas, right? Shell money was nothing like that. There's no way you could ever do commerce with original shell money, right? You could use it to do certain symbolic ritualistic actions like calling on the spirits of the dead, or as a symbolic gesture to somebody who you've injured their pride and they want to like get vengeance upon you, or you're symbolically showing how you appreciate your bride to the family by giving them a bunch of these arduously created shell trinkets. All right. So that's technically a kind of money, but it doesn't operate according to the principles that we would imagine money operates by, right? So the thing that we tend to be describing when we're talking about money is modern monetary systems, which really emerge with the advent of nation states, with essentially rulers pushing out units to get resources back. Okay. This is where chartalism as a sort of theory comes in. So chartalism is one of the big theories of how monetary systems work and how they get kick-started. All right. Which is this idea that monetary systems in their initial incarnation are a political tool for rulers to get resources. All right. After which it becomes used for markets. I can delve more into that if you want me to.
No, I mean, it's interesting, but like, I think the foundation is laid that like these things are not money, but I'm going to ask you the question again until I get the answer. I mean, what are they?
Okay. Well, I mean, but yeah,
how would you describe them? Like what
in the chartless conception, money will be IOUs issued out by the state in the banking sector.
Yeah. But that's not what crypto is, right? Crypto is no.
So crypto, the core. So let's do the normal monetary system. The normal monetary system is literally speaking credits or like IOUs issued out in a few different layers. The initial layer being the state, but the secondary layers being the banking sector, and then there's even tertiary layers, right? And they're credit instruments, and we then use the credit instruments between ourselves. So if you want to imagine it visually, you would imagine it on a vertical and a horizontal dimension, right? This is how I do it. Okay, so you'll have issuers that push out money, right? Sort of in a vertical plane. It goes push out and pulls back in, pushes out, pulls back in.
And the pulls back in is through taxes generally?
Yeah. Or there's various ways it can be pulled back in, right? But you push it out, pull it back in. All right. And this is how you keep the sort of like tension in the monetary network. But once it's pushed out, we can use it between ourselves in a different dimension. Okay. Now, one of the important concepts to grasp, if you're thinking about credit theories of money, is the idea, and this is a sort of like let's call it a primitive. All right. This is just a primitive concept which becomes useful for understanding all types of credit money systems, which is the idea that you can pay by promise. Okay. So the idea of paying by promise is that I don't actually need to have anything to induce you to give me something, right? I can issue a promise to you to get something. Now, friends understand this between themselves. I can say like, hey, I'll give you something in a bit. And what I'll find is like a resource comes to me through the act of me pushing out a sort of informal promise. Okay. And a lot of quasi early money kind of things have this principle to them. You can sort of push out these promises in exchange for goods and services. And this very much links into that earlier point I made about the fact that human beings are interdependent. In many systems, a person doesn't initially have something. They first have to get something before they can produce something. All right. A lot of human beings they don't have a pre-existing battery of energy to make something before they can how do I say this? Like you often have to get something from other people before you yourself can do something.
You need some startup investment, like,
exactly. But like, like kids understand this. Like a kid doesn't have the ability to just produce something before their parents first give them something. So the initial thing most people will be getting in society is a form of credit. You're first getting stuff from others before you have the ability to produce for others, right? So this is the sort of default starting position, and the sort of credit thinking on money builds on this intuition to say stuff like, okay, people have these more formalized, larger scale systems of credit where before I can start doing something, I have to first get something from you. So I issue an IOU. I say, hey, I'll get you something back in future, right? And that good comes this way, right? As you sort of formalize those structures, they become more like monetary systems. And if you look at the modern monetary system, it's a very, very large version of that principle. So in that, this gets very trippy, I'm sorry, but like in that like vertical dimension I was mentioning of a monetary system, we have these huge issuers who are pushing out these like credit instruments saying, we're going to suck back resources in exchange for giving these units out to you. All right. Mm-hmm. Once they've done that, we can then use their credit instruments between ourselves in the sort of like secondary network. Now, when economists are saying things like, oh, money is a unit of account, store of value function, they're talking about that secondary thing. They're talking about that secondary use of the primary state and bank issued IOUs. And this is my critique of those functions of money approach, is that if you're only talking about the surface level experience of passing around state issued IOUs, you're going to miss what's actually going on in this huge sort of like this huge structure, right? So the modern monetary system is a very, very large scale version of the credit system, but you can change the dynamics of those. So lots of alternative monetary experiments like mutual credit systems, for example, try to sort of flatten the power dynamics of a credit money system. Now, one thing I'll say about this is that one of the fascinating ironies that emerges in a large-scale credit money system is the fact that people who are within those systems often imagine that money is a commodity, all right? Because if you have these huge institutions we're using all their instruments to create these huge networks between ourselves, it actually pulls people apart. All right, it creates these huge network structures, and in those massive systems, we get pulled ever further away from each other. Right, so it generates this imagery that we're individuals. You say, "Well, I'm just this guy in New York City. Nobody knows me. I'm just like a solo hustler." This whole kind of mentality you have. In that situation, which has been induced by super large institutional structures, you start to fantasize about this idea of being an individual, which is the root cause of why you then imagine money as a commodity, right? Because if you have this mentality, you start to imagine that what you're doing in a monetary system is using a commodity-like object to induce another solo individual to do deals with you, right? So all the sort of commodity money fantasies actually emerge from super large-scale state money, credit money structures. And this is the deep irony of the Bitcoin system, is actually all that commodity imagery comes directly from the situation of being in a large-scale fiat money system.
But then we have systems like DAOs, right? Where a DAO is going to issue a currency to, try to coordinate more effort towards a shared goal. And the people who are participating in that economic system, they're actually like coordinating it more effectively because of some of these crypto tokens, like not Bitcoin so much, but some of these cryptocurrencies are actually bringing people together.
Don't get me wrong. I mean, look, I'm not trying to, when I make these critiques of the crypto world, I'm not saying it doesn't have fascinating, useful. I mean, even with Bitcoin, I think the counter trade uses of Bitcoin are fascinating. I think it's authentically useful to have a sort of like quasi money like object that you can counter trade. That is useful.
Okay,
right?
So here I'm stuck in this DAO paradigm where we think we're issuing money, and we're not creating new monies. We're creating something else.
Well, you want to think of yourself as maybe creating forms of counterpower within a much larger system, right? If you're under the delusion that you're fully replacing the existing system, then you're deluded, right?
Okay.
But if you're thinking more sort of like, maybe a sort of more anarchist terms, like being like, okay, we're creating a sort of forms of outside space within a bigger system, right? Like that's probably more realistic for what the crypto world aims towards, right? And it's possible that
we're creating parallel structures. We're creating parallel economies.
It's possible that in order to generate the motivation to do that, you have to engage in the fantasy that you're replacing another system.
Yeah.
Right? So I actually understand the internal ideology of many crypto sort of projects. It's like, we're fighting the system. And it's like, it seems like you're pretty damn dependent upon the actual system. But maybe you need that delusion in order to keep up the kind of like the self-image required to actually have motivated to sort of build this thing, which will end up being a kind of partial counterpower, right? And in a way, this is why I think it's more interesting to think about crypto structures as being kind of like sort of symbiotic or even sort of quasi-parasitic, rather than like predators that are destroying like the fiat money system. I mean, it's like, it's more, there's something more like compelling in a way about imagining them as being these sort of systems of partial counterpower, right? And I think the DAO, the sort of intuition behind lots of the DAO communities is about how do you create large-scale institutional structures that have a different power dynamic to them, right? Because bear in mind, in much of the original alternative economy movements prior to crypto, often the intuition was, when faced with the vast like corporate capitalist system, which the intuition was, let's pull back from it. All right. Yeah. Let's create a small permaculture village. Let's create a little commune. All right. Yeah. And it's like, well, you're basically trying to like resist the vortex of this gigantic like interdependent network structure held up by these huge banking institutions and stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And that's going to be really, really hard to do because it's going to be exhausting, right? Which is why the history of alternative anarchist like projects is like littered with all these like dead websites of projects that once existed, but then the people just got exhausted. Well, totally. What's interesting in the crypto world is that there's a sort of attempt to say, well, we could harness some of the dynamics of the vast market structures. So, for example, like the sort of token speculation is this like a very egregious, or maybe it's a very like obvious example of people just like harnessing late stage capitalism to like, but with this idea that, well, maybe we could use this to sort of like Trojan horse, these kind of like platforms into being and as a sort of counterpower in the system. And that's kind of interesting,
So Paralini Police like strategy of building something alongside to solve some of the problems while not completely throwing away everything, not going into the woods and starting your own like cult or something, but like just living within society with something to the side.
Yeah, and I think it's why crypto has become so compelling to many younger people, is this idea that it has a fairly high degree of integration into the normal capitalist economy, right? Whilst offering this sort of slightly outside vision that it's actually not, right? Which for a person who has ideals and stuff actually is quite compelling and it's quite interesting. So I think that's what's often capturing people.
I mean, you used to have to have an army to start an economy, right? Now you just need to know a couple of nerds and you're good to go. You can create your own economic system that rewards people for doing certain behaviors. But we should call it. We could talk forever. I want to make sure it's digestible.
And I hope I haven't said any like unnecessarily complex things. We probably like need another hour.
If people are going to listen to this podcast, then they're going to get stuck on complex topics for sure. But Brett, please tell us where people can find you. Like how do people learn more if they were like, what, it's over? Like, where do they go next?
Well, my book is out, which is Cloud Money. Cloud Money is all about like digital money versus cash and the dynamics of big tech meets big finance, right? So it's looking at a lot of the sort of real politic of the existing system. And also how the sort of crypto movements relate to that. So Cloud Money's around, but also probably if you're interested in my monetary stuff, that's sort of more on the sort of geeky kind of like money things. It's like my newsletter is brettscott.substack.com, which is Altered States of Monetary Consciousness, where I try to sketch out the sort of the background different ways of thinking about the monetary system.
Yeah.
So also on Twitter, I'm Soup Possum.
Soup Awesome. Yeah. And we actually have that down below so you can see it. Soup Awesome. And I have to recommend your blog. I would call it a blog. I don't know. Your newsletter. Yeah. It's really really entertaining and engaging. So well, thank you, Brett, so much for joining us. And if you enjoyed this podcast or wherever you are, like, subscribe, whatever that means. And we'll see you at number 2. Thanks, Brett.
Cheers.
So this is really actually kind of a surprise outtake, quick clip from our first episode. I was putting Brett Scott's feet to the fire saying, like, what is crypto? What is crypto? The whole episode. And I think he thought we would go longer. And so after all of these podcasts, there's a little moment where I call it the after cuddle, where the interviewee and the interviewer kind of chat about how it went and all of that. And so I just want to share that with you, especially because it introduces Almond, who is actually managing this whole podcast. I don't do anything. I get up there and I start talking and hanging out with a friend of mine, and it's really fun. But Almond is actually behind the scenes doing the work, so it's really great to just have her in there, and also you can kind of see behind the scenes what's going on in the GM podcast, as well as actually hear what Brett Scott thinks crypto is for real, without the whole like, oh, we're in a podcast experience. And I think it was very definitely worth sharing. So I hope you can enjoy it. The thing I kept putting your feet to the fire on is, what is crypto then? I get it's not money.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure.
That's where like
digital collectibles, the price.
digital collectibles. So digital collectibles. So is it a commodity, or is it an economic system, or is it both?
It's digital collectibles at the price, and you can do whatever you want with that.
You can use digital collectibles with a price to create an economic system.
Yeah, and that's actually, I know you guys need to go now, but one of the things I often say to people, like, that's sometimes taken as a critique. I'm like, well, no, that's what you got. Like, now you've got to figure out how to work with that. I mean, all the Bitcoiners get pissed off with me. They're like, you say this is not the fiat killer. I'm like, well, yeah, clearly not. Like, well, now get over it and decide what you're going to do with it.
Yeah,
like it's and it's, so to me, that's like, it's trying to be sort of real with it and be like, okay, it's fascinating that you've managed to create this. I think there's way better crypto systems than something like Bitcoin. But like, if you do for the Bitcoiners, if you do want to sit in that world and constantly like imagine that's going to be the future, but you got to build a really good strategy for how you're going to actually make that into what you want it to be.
Are you pretty familiar with DAI and RAI? Like,
I mean,
are those the closest thing to money that we got in crypto?
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because those systems essentially use counter trade to try and artificially induce a sort of like money kind of thing, which is quite interesting. I actually find that quite fascinating. So
I mean, I according from our just talk, I feel like that those would be the two things that you would say like most money-esque. No?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just standard stable coins that are backed are very money. I mean, those are money.
Okay, you would say like USDC is more like money than.
I mean, that definitely is. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. See, now we're getting to the meat of it, man. Crap.
Well, so you need one of those like 2-hour long podcasts.
Exactly.